You were sitting in the back of a red Songthaw, the open-sided pickup truck that passes for a taxi in this part of the country, and the road ahead is dissolving into flat green nothing. Rice paddies stretch out on both sides, broken up by the occasional concrete utility pole, a roadside shrine draped in orange marigolds, a motorbike hauling more than any motorbike should. The coast is behind you now. You can't see it anymore, but you can still smell it. That salt and diesel air you've been breathing for 14 months, and part of you is gripping that smell the way a man grips a railing on a listing ship. In your lap, there is a manila envelope held shut with a red rubber band. Inside it are documents you picked up from the district office 3 days ago at Knox's request. They're mostly in Thai. You have been studying the language in the slow, inconsistent way of a man who tells himself he's serious about it but keeps skipping days. The documents defeat you. But one word appears on the top sheet, again in a header further down, again in the margins in smaller print, and that word you know, Beta. Father. The driver checks you in the mirror every few minutes, not suspiciously, just with the mild curiosity of a man who doesn't see many foreigners heading inland with paperwork. You feel his eyes flick up to the glass, hold for a second, then drop back to the road. You shift your weight on the wooden bench, feel the vibration of the engine through the slats, and turn your head deliberately toward the window so he'll stop. The road narrows. A temple appears between the trees, its roof tiles glaze the color of a deep bruise, then disappears again. You watch it go and think about how many temples you've passed in this country without knowing their names, without stopping, without understanding what they meant to the people who built them. Knock texted you this morning at 6 o'clock. Please come. My family want to see you. That was it. No, how are you? No, sleep well. Just the address and those 8 words and the weight of everything that has been building since a Tuesday 4 months ago when she sat across from you at the table with a small plastic stick and said your name once, quietly, and waited. You need to go back further than that to understand how you ended up in this truck. You need to go back to the airport, to the return flight you never took, to the version of yourself that boarded a plane thinking he was going on a holiday and quietly decided, somewhere over the South China Sea, that he was not going home. You remember the exact moment. The cabin lights were dimmed, most passengers asleep, the flight tracker on the seat back screen showing the small white icon of the plane inching across blue nothing. You were looking at the map and thinking about your apartment, your city, the people who would expect you back in 3 weeks, and you felt something in your chest unclench at the thought of not returning. Not a decision yet. Just the recognition that the option existed. You landed at Savarnabhumi on a Thursday in the low season when the humidity sits on the city like a damp hand and the arrivals hall smells of jet fuel and mango, and the particular cologne of 100 different kinds of ambition. You had a return ticket for 3 weeks later. You had a carry-on bag, a laptop with 2 client contracts, and a story you'd been telling yourself for about 8 months, which went roughly like this: your last relationship ended, your career was going nowhere specific, and you needed to recalibrate. That was the word you used. Recalibrate. As if your life were a piece of equipment that had drifted slightly off course and just needed a few small adjustments before it was back to optimal. The truth, which you were not quite ready to tell yourself yet, was less organized. There'd been a professional embarrassment, something public enough that people you knew had seen it, a project that collapsed, responsibility landing on your shoulders in a way that was probably fair and felt completely unjust, in a city that suddenly felt very small in all the wrong ways. You'd walk into rooms and feel the knowledge of the failure preceding you, a small cold front moving through the social atmosphere. People were kind about it, which was worse. Thailand was not a plan. Thailand was the place on the map that was far enough away, cheap enough to sustain, and warm enough that the failure would at least be scenic. You spent your first 2 weeks in Bangkok the way every version of you spends their first 2 weeks somewhere new, spending money at a rate that is unsustainable, eating everything, sleeping badly, feeling the specific dopamine of having no fixed obligations. You'd wake at noon, walk through the oven heat to a street stall, eat something you couldn't name, and feel the strange lightness of a life with no witnesses. Then you drifted south. Hua Hin for a week because someone on a forum recommended it, then further south toward the Gulf Coast, past the packaged her towns, to a smaller place whose name you could barely pronounce when you arrived and now say without thinking. You practiced the name in your head on the bus down, sounding it out syllable by syllable, a private rehearsal for a version of yourself that would eventually belong here. The town had one main road, 3 7-Elevens, a morning market that smells of lemongrass and charcoal, and month-to-month apartments above convenience stores that cost 7,000 baht and ask no questions. You found the apartment in an afternoon. You stood in the empty room, one window facing the street, a bed frame with no mattress yet, a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly on its mount, and you thought, this is temporary. You extended your remote contract with a client in your home country who had not yet noticed your time zone had shifted by 6 hours. You told yourself you'd stay 2 more weeks, then a month. You needed a border run to Malaysia every 60 days to reset your tourist visa, a full day on a bus, a stamp at the crossing, a bus back. The first time you did it, you were nervous, rehearsing explanations in your head that no one asked for. By the 4th time, it was routine. The immigration officer on the Malaysian side had started to recognize you. He never said anything. He just looked at the passport, then at your face, and stamped it with the resignation of a man who has seen this particular story many times. You'd hand him the passport, he'd flip to the page with all the Thai stamps clustered together like a visual record of your indecision, and he'd pause for exactly 1 beat before bringing the stamp down. That pause was the closest thing to a conversation you ever had with him. Nok worked at a restaurant 3 streets from your apartment. Not a bar. You always clarify that when you tell the story, and the fact that you always clarify it is its own small revelation about the story you're constructing, about what you need people to understand before they judge any of it. She managed the front of house, seating people, handling the check, keeping the whole operation running with a quiet efficiency that you noticed before you noticed anything else. You watched her move between tables, remembering orders without writing them down, defusing a complaint from a German tourist with a smile that cost her nothing and gave him nothing, and you recognized something in her composure. It was the same thing you'd been failing to achieve since you arrived. The appearance of someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be. Her English was better than she initially let on. She would let you struggle toward a sentence in Thai, wait patiently until you'd assembled something approaching meaning, and then respond in English so clean it made you feel both corrected and cared for. You remember the first time she did it. You'd spent 30 seconds constructing a question about the menu, proud of your pronunciation, and she answered in a single fluid sentence that contained no accent you could place and no condescension you could resent. You asked for her number after your 3rd visit to the restaurant. She gave it to you with the kind of smile that is not a yes and not a no, but is something more interesting, which is a question waiting to become an answer. You held the scrap of paper she'd written it on, a receipt from the restaurant, her handwriting small and precise, and you felt the particular nervousness of a beginning that might actually matter. You texted that evening. You typed and deleted 4 different versions before settling on something simple, and then you waited. She replied the next morning. You spent the intervening hours checking your phone more often than you wanted to admit, constructing narratives about why she hadn't responded, all of which turned out to be wrong. Within 3 weeks you were seeing each other several times a week. Within 2 months she was spending most nights at the apartment above the 7-Eleven. Her side of the small wardrobe arranged with a precision that made your side look like a crime scene. You'd watch her fold a shirt, the economy of movement, the way she aligned the seams exactly, and understand that she had been organizing chaos long before you arrived. She had a degree in hospitality management from a university in Bangkok. She had worked in the city for 4 years at a hotel group before coming back to the coast. The reason she came back, you understood in outline but never in detail. Something had ended in Bangkok. A life she had built, and then disassembled. She mentioned it once, briefly, not looking at you, and changed the subject with a skill that told you this was a practiced maneuver. You did not push. You told yourself it was respect. She might have called it something else. You sat with the silence she'd left, the shape of an untold story filling the room, and you chose not to enter it. Every morning she made offerings at the spirit house mounted on a post outside the building entrance. Small jasmine flowers twisted onto a wooden skewer, a glass of water, incense lit and planted in a brass bowl full of ash. She said the same few phrases quietly, eyes down, the smoke curling up past the miniature carved figures inside the spirit house. You'd stand behind her sometimes, watching the ritual, feeling like an observer at something that didn't require your presence but permitted it. You asked her once what she was asking for. She said protection for both of you. You photographed it and sent it to a friend back home with a caption about Thai culture, and you did not notice that your first response to something intimate was to make it content. You didn't notice until later, until you were lying in bed replaying the moment, that you had taken something she offered seriously and turned it into a post. 3 months in, she was at your apartment more nights than not. You went to the temple on Makabucha Day because she asked. You ate at her aunt's house twice and were introduced both times as her Farang boyfriend. The word carried no cruelty. It carried a category. You were always, in any room that included her family, the Farang. You thought this was charming. It was also a ceiling, and you had not yet looked up far enough to see it. You'd smile when they said it, accept the designation with the good humor of a guest who knows his role, and miss entirely that the role was defined by its impermanence. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday. She did not make a scene. That is the first thing you need to understand about what happened, and everything that came after. There was no drama in the delivery. She came home from the clinic. She had gone alone, which you realized afterward, which you should have realized at the time. You were at the apartment, working on your laptop, when you heard her key in the door, and you didn't look up immediately, and that failure of attention, small as it was, would replay in your mind for months. She set the test on the table between you with the same composure she brought to every practical matter in her life, which was total. She said your name once, quietly, and then she waited. The plastic stick sat on the table between you, a small white rectangle with 2 pink lines, and the distance across the table, maybe 2 feet, felt like the distance between 2 countries that shared no common language. You said the right words in the wrong order. You said, "We'll figure it out," before you said, "Are you okay?" And the look that crossed her face in the half-second between those 2 sentences was not hurt exactly, but it was something close. The expression of a woman noting a data point she had suspected and has now confirmed. She nodded. She looked out the window at the 7-Eleven sign below, which buzzed slightly in the humidity. You reached across the table, and she let you take her hand, and you stayed like that for a while, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than you could say for most of what had come before. She was 3 months along. She had known for 3 months before she told you. You absorbed this slowly, in stages, the way you absorb information that rearranges the room you thought you were standing in. You did the math in your head, counting backward, realizing that the entire period you'd been drifting, extending your visa, avoiding decisions, had been happening while this fact was already true and already known to her. She had been watching you, evaluating you, measuring your responses to small things while carrying the large things silently. She was not asking for your decision. You understood that gradually, too. She was not presenting a problem to be solved together. She was telling you what was already true and watching to see what kind of man you were going to prove yourself to be. The question had already been asked. You were just now arriving at the moment where it required your answer. You spent 3 days doing the wrong thing, which was research. You opened your laptop and typed, "Thai law foreigner paternity rights," and spent 4 hours on expat forums reading contradictory posts by men who were angry in different directions, some of them at the system, some of them at the women, some of them at themselves, most of them at all 3 simultaneously. You scrolled through threads that were years old, reading about custody battles and visa complications and men who had been separated from their children by legal systems they didn't understand. The forum threads were old. The advice was inconsistent. The comment sections were graveyards of unresolved situations and bad decisions archived for strangers to study. You closed the laptop at 1 o'clock in the morning, no more certain than when you'd opened it. What you understood, imperfectly, was this: without marriage, you had no automatic legal standing as the father. The child would be registered under Knox's name. To formalize your relationship to your own child, you would need to either marry her or go through a legitimization process at the district office, which required Knock's active cooperation and her family's involvement. You read that sentence in 3 different translations, hoping it would change. It didn't. You were not a citizen of this country. You were not even a legal resident. You were a tourist who kept renewing. And the renewal clock was already running. You sat with that phrase, renewal clock, and understood that it had been running since the day you landed, and you had been pretending not to hear it. You sent Knock 15,000 baht that week without discussing it. You transferred the money through the app, typed in the amount, and hesitated for a long moment before hitting send, aware that the gesture was inadequate and necessary and probably transparent in ways you didn't intend. She acknowledged it with a single line. Thank you? Nothing else. The distance in those 2 words was not indifference. It was waiting. She was still waiting, you realized, for you to become whatever you were going to become. Her mother called 2 nights later. You were in the kitchen when you heard the shift in Knock's voice, lower, faster, the particular cadence of someone navigating complicated terrain carefully. You stopped what you were doing, a pan in one hand, listening to the rhythm of a conversation you couldn't understand, catching only the emotional frequencies, reassurance, deflection, the careful management of maternal concern. When she came back into the room, she didn't sit. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed loosely over her chest, and she told you plainly that her mother wanted to meet you. And then she told you about Sinsod, the traditional bride price, she explained, in the flat tone of someone delivering information rather than making a demand. Paid to the bride's family, common in Thai marriages. The amount varies depending on the woman's education and family circumstances and the resources of the man. She said this last part without looking at you, which was its own kind of mercy, because it meant you had a second to arrange your face before she looked up. You felt your jaw tighten, your shoulders rise slightly, the physical response of a man hearing a number before the number has even been named. You asked what the expectation was? She said her family would discuss it when they met you. She said they were reasonable people. She said the situation was what it was, and they understood that. And then she turned and went to the bathroom, and you stood in the kitchen with your hand on the counter and worked out, in the silence of the apartment above the 7-Eleven, that you had approximately 180,000 baht left in the account you were living from. 4 months of current expenses, maybe 5 if you were careful. Not enough to be the man her family was about to sit across from and evaluate. You did the calculation 3 times, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves, and they didn't. The village was 2 hours inland by Songtho. You arrived in the early afternoon when the heat was at its most direct and the light bleached everything to the same flat intensity. You stepped down from the truck into a yard of packed red earth with a concrete house at the far end and a spirit house out front buried in marigolds so fresh they were still bleeding color. The earth was hard under your shoes, the heat rising through the soles, and you stood for a moment adjusting to the stillness of a place that was not built for movement. Her mother met you at the gate. A small woman, shorter than Knock, with the same quality of stillness in her face. She looked at you for a long moment before she spoke, and you understood that the evaluation had already begun, that it had begun the moment the Songthaw pulled up, that every second you spent in this yard was being recorded and assessed. Her father was already seated inside at a low lacquer table, a man with construction workers' hands resting flat on the wood, watching you cross the room with an expression that was not unfriendly but was absolutely evaluating. 2 uncles sat to the left. In the corner, on a rattan chair, Knock's grandmother. She was small and very still, with the kind of face that has stopped performing anything for anyone. She looked at you the way you imagine a judge looks at a defendant before the evidence has been presented, no conclusion yet, but complete attention. There was food. There was Singab beer brought out specifically for you, an assumption that was correct, and the gesture of it, the small attention to what a guest from somewhere else might want, undid something in your chest that you hadn't realized was braced. You accepted the beer, felt the cold of the bottle against your palm, and recognized that someone in this house had thought about you before you arrived. You sat down. Knock translated in fragments, smoothing the edges of things, finding the English that fit without losing the meaning. You watched her work between two languages, selecting words carefully, and understood that she had been doing this her whole life, mediating between worlds, and that she would be doing it for the rest of whatever you were building together. Her father asked about your work. You described it honestly, which meant not impressively, and you saw his expression recalibrate slightly, absorbing the reality of a man who works on a laptop from a rented room rather than the wealthy foreigner he may have imagined. His hands didn't move from the table, but something in his posture shifted, a small adjustment to revised expectations. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, through the slow negotiation of translated conversation and tea being refilled and the uncles asking questions that Knox summarized rather than fully translated, you understood what was actually being asked. It was not primarily about money. The Sinsod would come, yes, but the question underneath it, the structural question the whole afternoon was built around, was simpler and harder. Who are you? And are you going to stay? Her mother said something to Knox, and Knox said in English that her mother wanted to know if you planned to live here. The question hung in the air, and you felt every person in the room waiting for your answer. You said you were thinking about it. The words left your mouth and immediately felt insufficient, a placeholder where a commitment should have been. Her mother listened to the translation and nodded slowly, which was not a satisfied nod. It was the nod of a woman who has logged the answer and found it inadequate. You saw her file it away, a data point in an ongoing assessment, and you understood that you had just failed a test you hadn't known you were taking. Then the grandmother spoke. She had not spoken all afternoon. She said something short, 4 or 5 words, directly to Knox, without looking at you. The room went still in the particular way rooms go still when the oldest person present has decided to contribute. Knox's face did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, a slight tightening, the way a person looks when something private has been made semi-public. On the drive back, you asked Knox what her grandmother said. Knox was quiet for a moment, watching the rice paddies go past. The light was beginning to soften, the late afternoon gold that makes everything look like a memory before it's finished happening. Then she said, you have a good face but a worried heart. You laughed because it was easier than not laughing. The laugh came out of you automatically, a defense against the precision of the observation. Knox did not laugh. She looked back out the window, and the songthaw rattled on, and the coastal smell came back to you in pieces as you descended toward the sea. You found a lawyer 2 weeks later through a recommendation on an expat Facebook group, the kind of forum populated by men at various stages of the same set of complications, some bitter, some pragmatic, a few who had somehow arrived at peace with it. You scrolled through the group at night, reading posts from strangers who had navigated the same system, some successfully, some not, and you tried to learn from their mistakes without knowing which parts were mistakes. The lawyer met you at a coffee shop in the nearest city. She was efficient, and she did not waste your time with softening. She opened a leather folio, removed a pen, and began drawing diagrams on a napkin to illustrate what she was about to explain. Under the Thai Civil and Commercial Code, she explained, an unmarried foreign father has no automatic parental rights. The child is registered in the mother's name. To establish legal fatherhood, you would need either marriage or a formal legitimization process requiring the mother's written consent and the cooperation of her family at the district office. She tapped the table once with her pen. Without that cooperation, she said, you could be present, you could pay, but you would have no enforceable relationship to your child in Thai law. None. The word landed on the table between you, heavier than anything else she'd said. She talked for another 20 minutes, visa categories, marriage visa requirements, the impossibility of your current tourist status as a long-term solution. You listened, nodded, asked questions that demonstrated you were following, and felt the architecture of your situation becoming more solid and less forgiving with every sentence. The document she slid across the table at the end was 2 pages printed in clean English with the word, legitimization, appearing 7 times. The fee for the consultation was 3,000 baht. You paid it and rode the songthaw home and read the document 4 times. The light was going orange outside the window, the Gulf flashing gold in the distance, and you folded the pages back into the envelope and looked at them and thought about how you had come to a country with a carry-on bag and a laptop and a need to disappear. And instead, you were now reading a legal summary of how to become a father in a jurisdiction where you didn't legally exist. You asked Nock to marry you on a Wednesday evening. No ring. You hadn't bought one yet, which was a failure of planning or nerve or both. You'd thought about buying one, had walked past jewelry stalls in the market, had stopped once in front of a display case, and then kept walking, and the ringlessness of the moment was its own confession. You said it plainly, sitting at the same table where she had placed the pregnancy test 6 weeks before, and you meant it with more clarity than you'd meant most things in recent memory. You told her you wanted to be here. You told her you wanted to be the father, properly, legally present. You told her you were done recalibrating and wanted to build something real. The words came out in a rush, unpolished, and you heard yourself saying them and understood that they were true in a way that your previous certainties had not been. She was quiet for a long time, not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. Her eyes were on you, but her attention was somewhere internal, weighing something you couldn't see. Then she said she needed time to consider. Not no, not yes. Time. You'd been in Thailand long enough to understand that time in this context meant the family was being consulted. Time meant there were conversations happening in a language you couldn't follow about a man they had met once, over Singapore beer and translated small talk, and whether he was the kind of man who stayed. You nodded, accepted the delay, and spent the next 3 days living inside the uncertainty she'd given you. 3 days later, she told you what they'd said. They liked you, she said, looking at the table. But they didn't know you. A man on a tourist visa, no stable income, no ties to the country, no plan that extended past the next 60-day renewal. This was not permanence. This was a man who had not yet chosen where he belonged. Her mother had used a phrase that Nock translated carefully, with the slight hesitation of someone trying to preserve the original weight. A bird that doesn't know which tree it belongs to. You heard the phrase and felt it land somewhere in your chest, a description so accurate that it functioned as an indictment. That night you lay on your back in the dark and counted what you had. 180,000 baht. The lawyer's legitimization estimate, minimum 45,000 baht. The Sinsod expectation Nock had quietly confirmed, 100,000 baht, already reduced from the customary figure given the circumstances. You would be left with roughly 35,000 baht, which was about a month of expenses, and then you would be a man with a Thai marriage certificate, a new baby, a legitimized paternity claim, and no financial runway at all. The math was not in your favor, but the math was also not, you understood somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning, the point. You stared at the ceiling, the fan turning in its slow wobble, and tried to think about something other than numbers. You called your mother from the apartment balcony the next morning while the town was still waking up, the first motorbikes threading down the street below, a vendor pushing a cart of green coconuts along the gutter. The air was still cool enough to be pleasant, the brief window before the heat asserted itself. You hadn't told her any of it. You'd been calling less frequently for months, defaulting to text, keeping the story of your life abroad pleasant and vague. And now you told her everything in the flat, factual voice of a man who has run out of the energy required for editing. You described the pregnancy, the visa situation, the family meeting, the grandmother's verdict, the legal consultation, the financial arithmetic, and the proposal that was still waiting for an answer. She went quiet in the particular way mothers go quiet when they are sorting through what they feel and what they think you need. She let you finish. Then she asked one question, the one you should have been asking yourself for 3 months. Do you love her? The question sat in the humid air between your phone and your ear, and you noticed, with a slow and terrible clarity, that you had spent the entire pregnancy period thinking about visa categories, legal frameworks, money, the family's expectations, forum posts from strangers, and the particular anxiety of your own indeterminate status in this country. And you had done almost none of the thinking that the question required. You'd been so precise about the cost of staying that you had never actually sat down and calculated the cost of leaving. Not the financial cost. The other one. You stood on the balcony, phone pressed to your ear, and watched a motorbike pass below, and you didn't have an answer ready. You booked a flight home 4 days later. Not to leave permanently, you told yourself that, and you have believed it. You repeated it in your head like a mantra: not permanent, not leaving, just sorting things out. You needed to access savings properly. You needed to sort the remote contract, which was fraying, and either revive it or replace it with something that could actually sustain what you were contemplating building. You needed to talk to people who knew you before Thailand, who knew the version of you that had not yet come unmarred, and hear what they thought. You needed, though you didn't phrase it this way to yourself, to find out whether the man who had run away to Thailand was still the man who ran away from things, or whether something had changed. Nok drove you to the airport in the car she borrowed from her aunt. She didn't cry. You half expected her to and told yourself you hoped she would, because it would mean certainty, and you understood while you were still thinking it that the hope was entirely for your benefit and not hers. She held your hand in the car and looked at the road. At the departure's drop-off, she got out and stood with you for a moment in the exhaust-thick air, other cars pushing past, and she straightened the collar of your shirt with 2 fingers in the absent way of someone who has already made a private decision and is waiting to see if you'll arrive at the same one. Before you went through security, she pushed something into your jacket pocket. You didn't look at it until you were in the air. It was a small Buddha amulet on a thin cord, the kind sold at temple market stalls for 50 baht, the kind Thai people give for protection on journeys, the kind they give, you understood, at altitude, when they are not certain you are coming back. You held it in your palm, felt its slight weight, and understood that she had given you a gift that was also a test, and that you didn't know yet whether you would pass it. You were gone for 7 weeks. The practical things got done. You extended the remote contract through a conversation that involved admitting you had relocated, which your client absorbed with less drama than you'd feared, and renegotiating to a slightly lower rate in exchange for confirmed availability. You liquidated a savings account you'd been treating as an emergency fund and discovered that the emergency had been quietly accumulating for 14 months. You transferred 15,000 baht to Nok every 2 weeks, and she acknowledged each one with 2 words. Thank you? The texts were getting shorter. You noticed this and did not ask about it, because asking about it would require a conversation that could not happen over a messaging app at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while you were sitting in the city you had left, surrounded by the life you had been avoiding. You told a friend over drinks one night, a man you'd known since before the collapse, who had watched you leave and had been tactful enough not to say much about it. You told him everything. He listened through the whole thing without interrupting, which was its own form of respect, and then he set his glass down and said, "You know what the worst part is? You actually want to go back. That's not a mistake. That's just a life you don't know how to claim." You thought about that on the way home. You thought about it for 3 days. Then you booked the return flight, one way. The flight cost 34,000 baht. You paid it, and did not do the arithmetic that followed because you had decided, finally, that the arithmetic was not the question. You landed at Savarnabhumi just before noon on a Tuesday, 7 weeks after you'd left, and the arrivals hall smelled of jet fuel and mango exactly the way it had the first time. You walked through the same corridors, past the same duty-free shops, and thought about how you'd walked through them 14 months ago with a return ticket and a story about recalibration. And here you were with a one-way ticket and something that felt cautiously like a direction. Nok was waiting near the exit, not at the barrier, not rushing forward, near the exit, arms at her sides, watching you come through the crowd. Her stomach was visible now in a way it hadn't been when you left, a gentle forward curve under her shirt. And seeing it, the physical fact of it, undeniable, belonging to both of you, hit you somewhere behind the sternum with a force you hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have known how to prepare for. You walked toward her, 20 meters through a crowded arrivals hall, weaving between families and luggage trolleys and a tour group moving collectively toward a coach. The longest 20 meters of your life. She watched you close the distance, and said nothing until you were in front of her, and then she said your name once, the same way she had said it over the pregnancy test, and you put your arms around her and felt her hands come up to your back, and neither of you said anything for a while. The marriage happened 6 weeks later. The ceremony at the district office was administrative, which in its own way was honest, two people signing documents in a fluorescent-lit room while a clerk processed the paperwork with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times. You signed your name on 4 different forms, each one a small surrender of solitude, and watched Knox sign hers beside you in handwriting you'd come to recognize as evidence of a life being built. The family ceremony in the village was different. The village ceremony had the marigolds and the incense, and the relatives arranged in order of seniority, and a meal that Knox's mother had been preparing since the night before, and the 2 uncles wearing their good shirts and the grandmother in her rattan chair. The Sinsod was displayed on a lacquer tray in the customary way, 100,000 baht in banded notes, and then, as happens in many Thai families according to tradition, returned to the couple quietly afterward. You had known it might go that way. The display was never about the money. The display was about respect, the acknowledgement that she was worth something, that her family had raised someone worth something, and that you understood this. The grandmother watched the ceremony from her chair. She did not smile, exactly, but when it was over and you walked past her toward the food table, she looked at you with that direct, unsentimental gaze and nodded once, a small, definitive motion. And somehow that one nod cost you more than the entire financial calculation that had been eating you alive for months. Your daughter was born on a Thursday morning in the hospital in the nearest city, in a delivery room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, with Knox's mother present, and you in a chair that was too small on the wrong side of a curtain until the nurse waved you in. Malee. The name came from Knox's grandmother, a jasmine flower, delicate and tenacious and fragrant and common as grass in this country, where she would grow up in a language you were still learning, in a family whose history predated you by generations, belonging to this place in a way you never would and she always would. You held her for the first time, and the weight of her, barely 3 kilograms, rearranged something fundamental in your understanding of what weight means. You looked down at her face, the eyes still closed, the hands curled into fists smaller than your thumb, and understood that every calculation you'd made before this moment had been about a different kind of math entirely. 3 weeks after Malee was born, you were up at 2 o'clock in the morning because Malee is up at 2 o'clock in the morning, which is simply how it is now, and Knock is finally sleeping after a week of not sleeping properly, and the apartment, a bigger one, a year lease, a step toward permanence, is quiet except for the small sounds of a baby deciding whether she's done complaining. You get up and lift her and walk with her in the dark, past the window where the town below is mostly silent, a motorbike somewhere on the main road, the 7-Eleven sign at the corner still buzzing its eternal blue-white. You're looking for the vaccination booklet. It needs to go in the hospital bag you're packing for the checkup tomorrow. You check the shelf by the door, then the drawer in the kitchen, and then you try the folder on the bottom shelf of the bookcase, the one where Knock keeps the household documents, lease, utilities, Malee's registration papers, your marriage certificate. The folder is thicker than you expected. The vaccination booklet is on top. Below it, clipped together, some old employment papers. You move them aside and there, beneath them, is a manila envelope you haven't seen before. Not addressed to anyone. You open it the way you have always opened things you probably shouldn't, quickly, before you can decide not to. It's an email chain, printed out and folded. Bangkok letterhead on the first page, a hotel group's logo, a reference letter request. The dates are from before you met her. Behind the email chain are employment records from the same hotel. And behind those, a lease agreement, a Bangkok apartment, her name and another name, a Thai man's name, on a joint lease that ended 2 months before she came back to the coast. You sit down on the floor of the living room with the folder in your lap and Malee making small settling sounds in the crook of your arm. You read enough to understand the shape of it, not all of it. Enough. The thing that ended in Bangkok was not just a career. It was a life she had built with someone completely, and then disassembled. She came back to the coast the same way you came to Thailand, carrying something she wasn't ready to name, needing distance from a place that had stopped feeling like hers, looking for the particular relief of a life that had not yet decided what it was going to cost. You sit with this for a long time. Malee falls asleep against your chest, her breathing slowing into the deep, trusting rhythm of someone who has never once doubted that the arms holding her will hold. The folder is in your other hand. The apartment is dark and warm and smells of the jasmine incense knock burns at the small spirit house she mounted by the front door after you moved in. The same ritual, the same glass of water and small flowers, the same quiet words asking for protection. You think about the 14 months you spent believing you were the complicated one, the foreigner, the uncertain one, the one who needed to be evaluated and assessed and tested for permanence. You thought the whole architecture of this situation, the meetings, the Sinsod, the legal conversations, the grandmother's verdict, was about whether you were enough, whether you were solid enough, present enough, rooted enough to deserve to stay. It never occurred to you that she was being evaluated, too, by her own private tribunal, wrestling with her own question about whether she was ready to try again, whether the man she was watching closely, the fawn with the worried heart who kept extending his tourist visa and had never learned which tree he belonged to, might somehow be the answer to a question she hadn't told you she was asking. You close the folder. You slide it back into the bookcase exactly as you found it. You will not bring it up. Not tonight, not this week, maybe not ever. Or maybe someday, in a different season, on a different kind of evening, when you've both had enough time with the life you're building that its weight can hold the weight of everything that came before it. That's not a decision you're making alone. That's a decision the two of you will make together or not at all. And either way, it will be hers to offer, not yours to take. You carry Malee back to her basket and settle her in it, and she stays asleep, her hands curled into small, loose fists. You sit on the edge of the bed where Nak is sleeping. The amulet is around your neck on its thin cord. You've worn it since the plane, every day. Outside, the first motorbikes are starting up on the main road. The sky through the window is the particular dark blue that comes just before dawn, when the night has decided to let go but the day hasn't arrived yet. You came to Thailand to disappear. You came to recalibrate, to put distance between yourself and a life that had become too visible in its failures, to find the particular freedom of a place that didn't know your name. You found something different. You found a woman who was doing the same thing you were doing and was better at hiding it. You found a daughter who will grow up calling this country home in every way you never will. You found, in the folder in the bookcase, proof that the thing you thought made you the unreliable one in this story was never yours alone to carry. The worried heart, the grandmother said. She wasn't wrong. But worried is not the same as absent. Worried means you understand mistakes. Worried means you're still here at 2 o'clock in the morning in a dark apartment in a country you came to as a tourist and stayed in as a father, holding a sleeping baby who weighs 3 kilograms and the entire rest of your life simultaneously, and watching the sky go from dark blue to the first pale gray of a Thursday morning in the town you never planned to stay in. You are a foreigner. That is on the paperwork, and it will stay on the paperwork. But Malee will never need to translate that word to know what it means to have someone stay. Somewhere tonight, a man is sitting in an airport with a one-way ticket and a question he hasn't answered yet. He's calculating costs. He's missing the point. The point was never the math.